you hear good things.
The courtroom is still. Lights dim. All eyes turn toward the screen. Jurors sit shoulder to shoulder, their faces washed in a pale glow. Every blink, every breath feels louder than it should. A chair leg scrapes across the floor, an ordinary sound that now feels jagged, misplaced. On the screen, the story unspools in silence. Not evidence in the abstract, but a moving picture that will follow them into deliberation. Frame by frame, it builds its own narrative. The video became more than evidence. It became a story the jury couldn't unsee. I'm Sidney Smith, and this is Murderous Podcast. This week's Murderous is Clara Harris in Part 4, Trial of a Wife. Last time on Murders, Clara Harris's life unraveled in a single night. She drove to the Hilton, her stepdaughter Lindsay beside her, following the trail of a husband who had already confessed. Inside, David Harris and Gail Bridges laughed together, unaware of the storm outside. Clara turned away from the glass doors and slid behind the wheel of her Mercedes. What followed was chaos and slow motion. The arcs of headlights looping through the lot, the sudden impact that sent David into the air. The fractured lens of a headlight left behind as evidence. Investigators measured every detail. Tire paths, body displacement, the broken plastic scattered across the pavement. Each mark told part of the story. And then came the private investigator's tape, time-stamped and undeniable. The night ended in tragedy. What began as suspicion had become evidence. And that evidence would now define her fate. This is Murderous Podcast, Episode 98, Clara Harris, Part 4, Trial of a Wife. The courthouse in Houston was packed. Reporters jostled for space near the front rows. Every day, cameras waited outside, eager for the glimpse of a woman who had once been the picture of suburban success. Inside, the air felt heavier than it should have. Wood-paneled walls, a jury box already half filled with men and women who would decide whether Claire had acted out of rage or out of intent. At the defense table sat Clara Harris herself, once a respected professional, now reduced to a figure in a pale suit, her expression difficult to read. Sometimes she stared down at the table. Other times she glanced toward the jury with eyes that seemed both hollow and pleading. The charge was clear: murder. But in Texas, the law held nuance. If the jury believed Clara killed, quote, under the immediate influence of sudden passion, close quote, a kind of temporary storm brought on by betrayal or provocation, her punishment could be reduced. It wouldn't change the conviction. Murder would still be the offense written on the record. But instead of life or decades in prison, the punishment range could fall into something shorter, measured in years rather than a lifetime. On one side of the courtroom, the state. Prosecutor Mia Magnus. Precise. Unsparing. Her opening posture steady as stone. She would argue that this was not a woman overcome by passion, but a woman making decisions behind the wheel, steering, circling, striking again and again. On the other side, the defense. Attorney George Parnham, known for his calm presence, the same lawyer who had defended Andrea Yates only months earlier. His task was monumental. Convince 12 people that what they saw on that tape was not calculation, but collapse. Not premeditation, but panic. Before a single witness was called, the court set its boundaries. The defense prepared accident recreation videos, exhibits 37 and 38. They hoped to show that Clara could only have struck David once, that the loops in the parking lot were not controlled hunts, but desperate maneuvers after the first impact. But under Rule 403, the safeguard against evidence considered confusing or misleading, the judge ruled them out. The jury would never see those tapes. The courtroom absorbed that silence. Still, the defense's expert would be allowed to testify, though without his most powerful visual aids. And so the frame of the trial came into focus. The state's case. Intent, proven by repetition, steering, looping, pressing down on the accelerator not once, but again and again. The case that was going to be presented by the defense, an emotional rupture, a wife blindsided by betrayal, her judgment collapsing in real time, her action spinning out of control. For Clara, the difference was everything. The jurors shifted in their seats, listening, waiting. They hadn't heard a single witness yet. Before anyone takes the stand, the rules are drawn. What the jury can't see matters almost as much as what it will. The prosecution began its case the way it always begins in a trial, with witnesses. Not arguments, not commentary, just voices sworn to tell what they saw. First came the hotel staff. The lobby manager recalled that he and the staff heard noise. Moments later, he followed the crowd outside into the lot. The manager described circles, headlights sweeping wide across the asphalt. Then the sight of Davis Harris lying in the lane, his body no longer in motion. Another hotel employee echoed the scene. From her position near the lobby, she testified to hearing the commotion first, then screams from outside. When she reached the door, she saw the Mercedes looping, not once, but more than once. A pattern of turns that looked deliberate, controlled. The state built its rhythm carefully, witness after witness, each one adding a stroke to the same picture. From the tennis courts across the way came still more testimony. Bystanders who had been playing under the lights looked up at the sound of tires. They told the jury they saw headlights cutting through the lot again and again. The body in the lane illuminated like a spotlight. They heard screams, sharp, terrified, and the grind of rubber pulling against pavement. Then came the private investigator. The man Clara herself had hired to prove her suspicions. He recounted the assignment, the surveillance, the hours of tape already logged. He explained the chain of custody, how the cassette that captured David and Gail's night at the Hilton passed from his hands to the courtroom's evidence table. And then, in silence, he described pressing play. The jury watched the very tape Clara had paid for. What they saw was not interpretations, but image. The circles, the acceleration, the impact. The state didn't need to embellish. The tape spoke in frames. Next came the medical anchors, police officers, the medical examiner. A detective walked the jury through tire paths sketched onto diagrams, the arcs that match the Mercedes looping turns. Fragments of a broken headlight were shown to correlate with the shattered glass at the scene. The medical examiner testified to the juries. Blunt force trauma consistent with vehicular impact. The displacement of David's body across the lot. The force that had lifted him into the air before dropping him back to the ground. Each account circled the same conclusion. Repetition, not accident. Steering, not loss of control. And then Lindsay, the stepdaughter who had been in the passenger seat that night. She took the stand, her voice quieter than the professionals before her. She testified to what she remembered. Her stepmother's hands on the wheel, the loops through the parking lot, the sense of resolve she thought she saw. The prosecution highlighted her words, though the jury was reminded to weigh them as testimony, not fact. Still, the image lingered. A child watching her stepmother circle her father. Piece by piece, the state layered its refrain. Not sudden, not accidental, again and again, steering into intent. The prosecution did not ask the jury to imagine. It asked them only to watch, to measure, and to remember. When the prosecution rested, the courtroom shifted. The state had shown its loops and circles, its tape, and its tire tracks. Now it was the time for the defense. It was their turn to redraw the picture, but without the one tool they wanted most: Those recreation videos, the ones that might have demonstrated a single impact, never reached the jury. Those exhibits 37 and 38 ruled inadmissible. Too misleading, too likely to confuse, the judge said. So the defense was left with words, diagrams, and the fragile weight of testimony. Their first brushstroke came from an expert. Accident reconstructionist Steve Irwin. Calm, clinical. He explained turning radii, impact physics, the distance a body might travel after a single strike. With models and measurements, he testified that Clara could not have run over David multiple times. The geometry, he said, simply didn't support it. The loops in the lot may have looked ominous, but to him, they were the byproduct of panic, not precision. Still, he admitted, the jury would have to take his word for it. They could not see the recreations themselves. And without the visuals, his testimony was a sketch, not a painting. Then came Clara. The woman at the center of the story rose from the defense table and walked to the stand. Her voice was steady at first, but carried the tremor of someone who knew every eye in the room was fixed on her. She told the jury she had never intended to strike David. Her aim, she said, was the black Navigator, the car that carried Gail Bridges. She admitted she wanted to hurt him, but not physically. She wanted to hurt him emotionally, to send a message that he could not humiliate her without consequence. She claimed she never saw him at the moment of impact, that what the tape showed as circles and arcs were, to her, blind loops of panic, not pursuit, but collapse. The defense built its case around those words. This was not the cool calculation of a woman plotting revenge. This was the shattering of a woman blindsided by betrayal. Her judgment broken in the instant she saw her husband with another woman. Her stepdaughter in the passenger seat beside her. They pointed to her background, her career, her family, her lack of a criminal record. Everything in her life, they argued, spoke to stability. Until that night at the Hilton, when her whole world cracked. But the jury had seen the tape. They had watched the arcs of light in the parking lot, the body on the pavement, the circles done by the Mercedes. Every word the defense spoke had to compete with the image still burned into their memory. So George Parnham slowed his rhythm. He reminded the jury that grief looks chaotic, that panic does not follow straight lines, that a woman discovering her husband's betrayal in real time is not a strategist, but someone unraveling at the seams. He leaned on the law itself. Texas recognized sudden passion as real. A storm of emotion that could overwhelm even an ordinary person. And if the jury believed Clara's storm was genuine, the law allowed mercy. It was not a question of whether she had killed. It was a question of why. And whether why could soften the blow of what. The defense knew they were painting with words, not images. but words were all they had left. When you can't show the jury your picture, you describe it brushstroke by brushstroke. So the defense rested, and with it, the long silence of jury deliberation began. Hours passed behind closed doors. 12 strangers sorting through the same questions. Was Clara Harris a woman out of control, or a woman who knew exactly what she was doing? When the jury filed back in, every eye in the courtroom followed. Reporters leaned forward. Family members clutched hands. Clara herself sat stiff at the defense table, waiting for the words that would define her life. The foreman rose. The charge, murder. The verdict, guilty. A wave of sound rippled through the courtroom. Sharp intakes of breath. Muffled sobs. The scrape of chairs as people shifted to see Clara's face. She showed little outward reaction, but her shoulders sagged, as if some final weight had pressed down on her. But Texas law had one more layer. That same jury was asked to decide a, quote, special issue, close quote. Had Clara acted under the immediate influence of sudden passion arising from adequate cause? If yes, the punishment range would not vanish, but it would narrow from the broad expanse of 5 to 99 years down to 2 to 20. And the jurors said, yes, they believed the passion was real. The offense remained murder, but the punishment would be measured inside a shorter span. The trial moved into its next phase, the punishment hearing. And here the lines sharpened. The defense called character witnesses, friends, colleagues, and family members who spoke of Clara's life before the Hilton parking lot. They described her as a devoted mother, a successful professional, a woman who had spent her life building, not destroying. They pleaded for mercy, for a chance to rebuild what had been broken. The prosecution answered with its own refrain. They reminded the jury of the brutality of that night, of the terror Lindsay felt in the passenger seat, of the permanent absence left in David Harris's family. They argue that passion might explain, but it did not excuse. That even in the heat of betrayal, choices had been made. And those choices had ended a life. To the state, doing the right thing meant holding Clara fully accountable, even inside the reduced range. On Valentine's Day, which had once been Clara and David's wedding anniversary, the jury delivered its final decision. 20 years in prison, a $10,000 fine. The irony of the date did not go unnoticed. What had once marked the beginning of a marriage was now stamped as the day its violent end was measured by law. The law allows for the heat of the moment, it does not erase what heat can do. And now that the verdict was in, the sentence delivered, where do we go from here? Because the story of Clara Harris didn't stop at the courthouse doors. In the days that followed, the case dominated local broadcast. Houston anchors spoke of a crime of passion, while national outlets framed it as a tale of jealous rage. CNN ran headlines that distilled the trial into a single phrase: wife, affair, Mercedes. The imagery was irresistible to newsrooms. The respectable suburban dentist who drove straight into betrayal. The wife scorned who had become the wife condemned. And then came the long tail. In 2003, CBS released a made-for-TV movie, Suburban Madness. It dramatized the case, turning Clara into a character for prime-time audiences. Cable series followed, Snapped, Deadly Women, each one carving her story into a different shape, depending on the angle of the camera. Writers added their voices too. Stephen Long's book, Out of Control, pieced together the case in prose. Clara herself tried to reclaim her own narrative. In 2005, she gave an interview to the Houston Chronicle from prison. She insisted again she had not seen David at the moment of impact, that what looked intentional was in fact blind panic. Her words reframed her role not as the avenger in a crime of passion, but as a woman caught in a spiral she could not control. That same year, she appeared on Oprah. Her story carried into millions of living rooms. There, too, she leaned on the same refrain. I didn't see him. Not revenge, not murder in cold blood. Just a moment that unraveled and could not be taken back. Prison became her life for the next decade and a half. She worked in the Braille unit, transcribing books for the visually impaired. She kept a low profile compared to the headlines that had once surrounded her name. When parole came up in 2013, it was denied. Again in 2016, denied. But in 2018, after serving 15 years, Clara Harris walked free. She returned to a quieter life, far from cameras. By 2023, her parole was completed. Her sentence, on paper and in practice, was over. But the story remained. The trial had ended, yet the tape lived on. Not just as evidence, but as an image replayed again and again on television, in books, on the internet. An ordinary marriage frozen into myth, told and retold in 100 different forms. The trial ended. The story didn't. The tape had turned a marriage into that myth. And myths keep getting told. The trial was over. The sentence delivered. But the jury's decision carried more than just the law. It carried the weight of an image. Because when a piece of evidence looks like a movie, it begins to feel like motive. The surveillance tape didn't just show a parking lot and a car. It showed loops, circles, a body struck and left behind. And when jurors watched it frame by frame, they weren't only weighing testimony. They were reacting to a story unfolding before their eyes. Was Clara Harris punished for what she did, or for who she was supposed to be? A dentist, a mother, a wife who lived in a world of golf clubs, country clubs, and carefully planned vacations. The image of perfection. When that image shattered, the fall was easier to frame as rage than as collapse. Easier to label than to sit with. And the labels came quickly. Scorned wife, crime of passion. Headlines that distilled a life into shorthand. Each phrase shaping how sympathy was measured and how blame was assigned. In the end, the tape became just a myth. A marriage reduced to a frozen frame, replayed endlessly until it replaced memory itself. A life paused on play. A verdict rendered not just in law, but in story. You've been listening to a production of Sidney Smith Creative, LLC, and the You Hear Good Things podcast network. All rights reserved. For more true crime stories that stay with you, follow Murderous Podcast on your favorite platform and join the Quiet Jury community on Patreon for early access, bonus content, and deeper cuts. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious.